Hello and welcome to Firstpost and our special coverage on Russian President Vladimir Putin's trip to India. This is his 10th visit to the country, and it's also the first one since the war broke out in Ukraine. A couple of hours from now, President Putin's plane is expected to touch down in India, and all eyes are on his talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What will be on the agenda? What sort of big-ticket defense deals or energy deals will the two leaders discuss? And what does this mean for the future of this very important and long-standing relationship? Joining me now to discuss this very important visit is Mr. Aleksei Zakharov from the Observer Research Foundation. Thank you so much, Mr. Zakharov, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Now, like I said, symbolically, this is a very important trip. It's coming after 4 years, and President Putin, as a country in India, we've gotten used to hosting him so occasionally, and it feels like this trip is coming after a long time. But on the deliverable side of it, what do you think will the Russians and the Indians be looking at from this trip?
Yeah, you're right. Beyond the extensive symbolism of this visit, I think that we have an extensive agenda and there are high expectations across different sectors that there will be outcomes not only in traditional spheres of cooperation, like in energy, but also in some new sectors that can be potential drivers for bilateral cooperation going forward. I think that the Russian delegation comes with a package of proposals on how to expand trade and economic cooperation between the two countries. I think that they want to address the imbalanced trade and to introduce some new measures on how to facilitate bigger Indian exports. Russia is interested to import more Indian goods, particularly in such areas as machinery equipment, technological products, maybe food and pharmaceutical products as well. So I think that trade and economic agenda will dominate this particular summit. We also have a huge Russia-India business forum happening today, and both leaders will address this forum tomorrow on Friday. So I can see an extensive agenda for talks. But let's wait and see for the deliverables and particular outcomes.
You mentioned trade there, and a couple of days ago, President Putin said that he does want to increase imports from India because that's a big concern here in New Delhi, that the deficit with Russia has simply ballooned since 2022. You mentioned some of the areas that could be used to address this gap, but how quickly can we expect this deficit to come down? Is something quick on the cards, or is this something that will happen over the years?
I think it may take some time, but not so much time, because actually there have been efforts to address this over the last several weeks and months. Even a few months ago, I think in late September, President Putin mentioned that he has already tasked the government officials to look into the issues that exist within the bilateral trade and to address them, to come up with ideas on how to resolve these issues, with particular focus to facilitate imports from India. Before that, actually, after the war started, Russia came up with a list of items that it would require and that could be exported by India to help Russia sustain its economy. So I think that both sides, they understand the areas, the niches that exist there for potential cooperation. So they just need to come up with solutions and facilitate the bilateral trade operations.
Now, another issue on the financial side of things is that of the rupee and the ruble trade, basically settling the exchanges that are happening between the two countries in local currencies instead of a foreign reserve like a dollar or a euro. Now, this is something that the Russians did have a problem with a couple of years ago when they said, we have a mountain of rupees and we don't know what exactly we want to do with it. Has progress been made in the last few years when it comes to settling in local currencies? And are you expecting something to happen on that front during this trip?
In this particular area, there has been a lot of progress from what we can hear from Russian banking officials and also Russian businesses. The trade mechanisms in national currencies, which is now dominating bilateral trade, I think it accounts for more than 90% of all trade operations between the two countries. So this mechanism works well, and it has happened largely thanks to the expansion of interbank cooperation. As you might know, Many large Russian banks have expanded their presence in India. They have not only they are not only present now physically in India, but they also facilitate many transactions between the two countries. And this ruble rupee mechanism is now operational, and I think that it's operating without the issues that existed a few years back. And the notion of the excess of rupees that Russia was struggling with like 2 years ago, I think it has largely been resolved. So now these rupees that are being generated there because of the imbalance in trade, they are now working and they're now being utilized by the Russian businesses. So to my mind, in this particular sphere, we have seen enough progress. But of course, from the Russian side, there is much interest to go further. There was one announcement that the Russian central bank is going to also open its branch in India early next year. So I think that the utmost priority, at least from the Moscow vantage point, is to further integrate financial systems and financial messaging systems in particular to make these payments between the two countries even smoother.
Do you get the sense that perhaps the Indian side is a bit wary of closer financial cooperation because of the prospect of sanctions? Because the United States and Europe are now talking about secondary sanctions, which could affect financial agencies that work with Russian agencies. Do you think the Indian side is a bit wary because of those secondary sanctions?
Well, I think that there is enough of, I mean, there are sufficient concerns, and of course, there are obvious concerns on the part of some Indian businesses, particularly private businesses that are globalized and they are exposed to their ties with global markets. I think that they are rather cautious to move ahead with any significant projects with Russia. And we actually have seen several big players, several big Indian companies that left Russian market after February 2022. When it comes to the smaller companies, I think that they are more eager to find some opportunities to cooperate and probably even enter the Russian market. But they need some help from both governments. When it comes to the public ones, I think that since the Russian economy is dominated by the state companies, it has been historically and has been traditionally easier to make cooperation at the state-to-state level. So if we look at the structure of economic cooperation between India and Russia, we will see that there are more tie-ups and partnerships between public companies of the two countries. And I think in this regard, the governments, they also support this cooperation between their businesses. And in this regard, the whole system, including the banking system, including the central banks of the two countries, they also join these efforts. And over the past 3 years, we have seen an upward trajectory of facilitation of these mechanisms of transactions, partnerships, doing business conditions. And I think that the businesses from both Russia and India, which are engaged in these operations, of course, which work with both markets, right. I think they have adapted a lot to the recent changes.
Let's talk about energy now, and specifically oil imports. That's one area that really ballooned after 2022. India virtually imported no oil from Russia before that, but now Russia makes up a significant chunk of Russian oil. The United States does not like that. They've imposed 50% punitive tariffs over those exports. So when Putin comes to India and meets Prime Minister Modi, what sort of offers will be making on the energy front to ensure that this cooperation continues? Are there more discounts perhaps, more investment opportunities? What is the Russian president bringing to the table this time?
Well, it's utmost Russian interest to ensure that India stays as a long-term customer of its oil, because it helps to make a long-term planning for the Russian budget, which is still dependent on the revenues from oil exports. It is also helping Russia to be more flexible with foreign markets, because it doesn't want to have over-dependence on China as the recipient of its energy resources. That's why I think that Moscow will come up with different proposals on how to ensure that this oil connection that have been crafted since 2022, it will stay resilient and it will stay immune in a way to the latest sanctions introduced by the United States. I think that there is conviction in Moscow that we could hear this from Russian officials, that oil will find its way, and it is possible to go ahead with oil shipments. It's just necessary to take into account the latest restrictions, but it is possible to recalibrate supply chains, to introduce maybe new workaround mechanisms, that there are still some Russian companies that are not there in the blacklists. At the end of the day, you can create the new companies and which are still not there, and you can also operate through intermediaries. So there has been a range of these workaround mechanisms that have been built over the past years, and since Russia is very much dependent on these oil shipments that are boosting and feeding its economy, I think it will try to convince New Delhi to use some ways on how to proceed with this oil connection between the two countries.
Right. I'm also curious about the discounts that are offered on Russian crude. This was a big conversation a couple of years ago, but now there seems to be an indication that those discounts have narrowed as oil prices have also come down since those levels. Do the discounts still exist? Is it still profitable for companies and the state-owned enterprises in India to buy from Russia?
I think that's one of the measures that Russia is trying to make, is to introduce new discounts, because it understands that following the latest sanctions, there have been more risks taken by the Indian companies who decide to go ahead with partnerships, to go ahead with contracts. That's why, to attract these partners, Russia has been offering higher discounts. At least it has been the case since October, when the US sanctions have been announced. But at the moment, the situation is a little bit uncertain. I think that we should probably wait until we will have some outcomes or implications from this summit's discussions, and we will be able to see whether some Indian refineries are still moving ahead with imports of Russian oil. I think it will be reflected in the statistics, and there will be some statements by the companies as well. But anyway, the discounts is an important measure, is an important attractive incentive from the Russian side on how to attract Indian refineries. And I think that Vladimir Putin was referring to that, providing his hopes that India will be interested to move ahead with the Russian oil imports, and referring to something that it's still beneficial because Russia is offering large discounts, and probably it can offset somehow India's losses in US tariffs. But of course, the ultimate decision is on the Indian companies that are there to make decisions whether to go ahead with imports from Russia or not.
Right. Let's talk about the defense relationship now, which has always been the cornerstone of this partnership between India and Russia. We're hearing a lot of reports about perhaps the Su-57 being on the table, or the S-500 missile system, more S-400 missile systems being on the table. Officially, there's no word about any of these discussions, but there's a lot of speculation and a lot of reports. Are you expecting any big-ticket acquisitions to be announced during this trip, or will we only see roadmaps and perhaps generic announcements of closer defense cooperation?
Indeed, I mean, we can see that the Russian defense minister has landed in Delhi, and he's expected to participate in the Intergovernmental Commission on Military Technical Cooperation. So he will hold talks with the Indian Raksha Mantri Rajnath Singh. So we could see very intensive discussions over the last months ahead of the summit. So probably there has been a lot of preparation work done from the both sides. At the same time, many deals that are extensively discussed in the media, they remain in their initial stages. And I think that probably coordinating technical modalities of these deals or formal procurement procedures will take more time. Additionally, as far as I noticed, both sides tried to keep the defense cooperation area low profile, especially after the war in Ukraine started. That's why probably following the summit or in the list of documents that will be following the summit, we will not see any big ticket announcements, but definitely there are several deals that are on the agenda, and probably there will be some informal or unofficial agreements or understanding on how to proceed with these particular deals.
Now, the idea of keeping these big ticket announcements not so high profile in the statement, is that because of the Western scrutiny that could follow such an announcement? Or is that because how India and Russia have traditionally negotiated defense agreements, just work out the modalities, ensure that all the technicalities and nuances are discussed, and then announce it when a deal is completely cooked?
It's both. I mean, defense area has been quite obscure, especially after 2017 when the United States introduced the well-known CATSA legislation. I think that Moscow and New Delhi were cautious in announcement of many deals that fall within within this legislation scope. And also, I mean, after Ukraine, particularly, they started to be more circumspect in terms of announcing or highlighting any developments in this particular area. So I think that both of these concerns are being taken into account.
Right. Now, in the long term, how do you see this defense partnership evolve and this equation change? I ask because if you look at the last century, for example, Russia was the primary supplier of weapons to India. The Soviet Union before that, around 60 to 70% of our imports came from there. Now that's come down into the 30s, and perhaps that will go even lower as India diversifies and focuses on self-reliance. So how do you see this equation changing? Do you see it becoming more of a symbiotic relationship where both of them work together, jointly produce or co-design new weapons? Where is this defense partnership going in the next 25 years, say?
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question, and it's a very interesting question to reflect on, because we can see several challenges in the way of moving ahead with defense partnership. First, Russia is still involved in its war in Ukraine, and of course, as we have seen in the case of the S-400 supply, there are some delays in shipments of military platforms that are part of bilateral contracts for several years. And obviously, currently, Russia is prioritizing the needs of its own armed forces. That's why maybe on some defense equipment, it just cannot give priority to exports. At the same time, some smaller deals, like some deals on the supply of spare parts, components, engines, I think they have been struck, and they have been delivered by Russia. Secondly, we have India's consistent efforts to diversify and to avoid any overdependence on Russia as a source of arms. And I think that the Russian share of India's Indian defense market has been going down consistently. And currently, Russia's share is not as significant as it was 10 years ago. So it's also a trend, and I think it's also a long-term trend, which we have to take into account.
Right.
And lastly, I mean, you rightly mentioned that I think that there is a new trend and a new effort on the Russian side, on the Russian part, is to come up with new proposals. One of them is to fit into the Indian program of Make in India and to localize the production on the Indian territory. That's what we see as part of Russian proposals for the recent deals, whether we take the Su-57 fighter jets, which Russia offers to produce on the Indian soil, and to also to also include technological transfer, and in the case of S-400 and potentially S-500. So I think that Russia is trying to count on fitting into the Indian story of enlarging its own production of defense equipment.
Right.
And there, I can see that there may be some possibilities of the two sides working together and using their strong points.
Now, finally, let's just talk about Ukraine, because President Putin is flying to New Delhi just days after he had that marathon meeting with US advisors at the Kremlin. There's no peace deal yet, but do you expect Ukraine to come up during the talks between Prime Minister Modi and Vladimir Putin? And more importantly, do you think they would feature in perhaps documents or joint statements that are put out later? Because Prime Minister Modi did tell Putin a couple of years ago that this is not an era for war, and that was splashed across global headlines. Things have changed from then to now. So do you expect the conversation to still veer towards Ukraine today or tomorrow?
I'm sure that the Indian government, or probably Prime Minister Modi himself, will deliver a similar message. I think that India's position on Ukraine has been consistent, and I expect that the war in Ukraine will be a large topic of informal conversation between the two leaders tonight during the private dinner that has been announced. I think that they will try to exchange their views, and I think that New Delhi will be interested to understand the status of the peace talks. As we have seen some progress with peace proposals, there have been several exchanges over the past week. There has been American delegations in Moscow, and they had a long conversation with President Putin and his close aides. So I think that New Delhi will try to make sense of what's going on and what is the current status of peace efforts on the one side, and also probably try to get an update on the Russian stance on the terms and conditions of the endgame in Ukraine.
Right. Well, along with Ukraine, because of how the things are shaping up across the world, this is a very crucial time for President Putin to be visiting India. There are conflicts around the world, there are peace talks, there are threats and tariffs and so much instability. And despite that, Russia and India stand as a very stable pillar in the geopolitical community in this uncertain world. We'll be tracking President Putin's trip very closely. He's expected to land in a couple of hours from now. But thank you so much, Mr. Aleksei Zakharov, for speaking to us on this very important relationship.
Thank you for having me.
I rose from the army with medals on my chest. I spoke of freedom from colonial chains, but I tightened my own. I filled prisons with ghosts. Nearly 500,000 people were butchered under my rule, and I trusted only my paranoia. I gave myself grand titles. I claimed to be Africa's strongman. History calls me something else, the dictator. Who am I?